Hi, I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Charlene. Welcome to Empowered, Life Lessons of Everyday Women.
Each episode, you're going to meet an amazing woman who has struggled through challenges both in her home life and work life and has become very successful. Meet Jody. Focus on technology. Jody spent 27 years in the Navy. She rose to the level of captain and was the commanding officer of the naval base in Guam. She eventually joined the Girl Scouts and developed Operation Thin Mint. So grab a cup of coffee, get in a comfy chair while we talk to Jody. Welcome, Jody. We're so happy to have you join us today.
Delighted to be with you.
So we get started right off the bat. If you were able to go back and talk to your 20-year-old self and give her a piece of advice, what might that be?
Technology, absolutely major. Take every opportunity you can to stay current with technology, math, science, engineering. Avoid what I call the comfort majors like art and music and creativity that you can get along the way. But once you leave the track of technology, it's very hard to go back.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's kind of, you've got to have a jumping off point if you want to stay current, basically, in technology. And we've talked a little bit about that.
And as a creative person, I got onto the Macintosh computers way back when, and I stayed current with the technology. That was definitely, like, for me, an advantage in my field, even as a creative.
Yeah, I see STEM and technology kind of like growing grapes for the vintage 5 or 10 years from now. If girls drop out of math and science at age 12, 13, they're never going to have a vintage year. They can never go back. So despite how hard it is, how challenging it is, how much you really, really want to be a ballerina, stay with STEM. You can pick up that later in life.
It's interesting because I know I've read places where girls tend to drop out of those things, not necessarily to always pursue maybe an artistic whim, but because they don't think it's cool. They don't think the boys are going to like them so much. And it's really interesting for you to put it in that perspective as vintage, because it really is groundwork that you need for almost every aspect that you go into.
Absolutely. I had 15 years working with Girl Scouts, and I saw that over and over and over. We tried very, very hard to encourage girls to stay with it, stick in it. Don't worry about what the boys think about you in math class if you're smart. I actually have a personal story about playing the saxophone when I was in middle school, and the boy next to me was first chair. His name was Crandall Lang. How could I not forget that? The most wonderful, sexiest, gorgeous young man in the world. And I knew I was getting better than him. And then my coach, the director of the orchestra, allowed us to compete for the higher chair every quarter. And one quarter, I knew I was going to beat Crandall. I knew I was good enough to beat him. And you know what I did? I quit. Instead of competing, I dropped out of music. And here I am telling you this story 50 years, 60 years later. But don't quit just because you're looking at some boy.
If they're worth their weight of salt, they're going to like you regardless of whether you're better than them. So you went to Stanford. You graduated from Stanford with a BA. What was that in? What study did you do?
Art history.
Art history. Interesting. Okay. I did not expect that based on the...
I did not either.
So now my next question is, all right, but you have 25 years in the Navy.
27, yeah.
27 years in the Navy. Okay. So how did you go from art history into the Navy?
I would say as fast as possible. There was absolutely nothing for me to do in art. The job market was zero. I really wasn't any good at it. I didn't like it. And I tell my college students now, don't expect to know what you will want to do the rest of your life when you're 18, 20, let alone 22. You will know what you don't want to do, and that's half the job. The students who are kind of introverted and they really like coding and like being in a small room and nobody to bother them, they shouldn't be selling shoes at Nordstrom. So you need to find out what you don't like. And actually, instead of art history, I started out as an organ major, this kind of organ major, playing with your feet and your hands. And my rehearsal time in the chapel was 11 o'clock at night on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I practiced in a small room, and it was the most isolating single person sport. It was awful. I knew I was not going to be an organist. So that's when I started changing majors over and over and ending up in art history. But students at that age need to know what they don't want to do and pursue what they do like and what they want. They don't necessarily need to know they're going to be a naval officer. But I enjoyed the travel, the people, and the challenge, and stayed in the Navy for 27 years. After all,
What prompted you deciding to go in the Navy? What prompted that?
nothing honorable, money, men, and travel, and I got them all.
I love that. Money, men, and what was the last?
Travel.
Travel.
Not necessarily in that order.
So obviously, there are some challenges that you probably faced in your naval career. Can you talk about maybe one or two of your biggest challenges that you faced during that time? Because you spent 27 years in that area.
Yeah, well, you're probably leading toward the being the only woman in the room and having issues with men. Well, certainly every professional career is going to have that challenge for women. But what I loved about the Navy was I had 15 different tours of duty assignments, picking up and going and changing. So, I always said, if you don't like your boss, either you or he will be gone next year. So I love the churn of new responsibilities and challenges. And I must say, for every Cretan I met, and there were a few along the way, there were 5 egalitarian men who had daughters like me and encouraged me and gave me challenges and helped me not fail. So I was very, very inspired by the male leadership in the Navy.
Did you look at them as kind of your champions, so to speak?
Of course. Of course. I didn't have any women role models at all. I was either the first or the only or the most senior woman in every one of those 15 jobs. So I had no role models until very, very later in life, when we would occasionally have a woman get selected for admiral. But those days were very, very much male dominated.
I imagine so. You talked a little bit about being an all-volunteer force. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm not familiar with that.
Sure. Not sure who your listening audience is, but back in after the Vietnam War, the American people had zero tolerance for draft. Very, very chaotic time in our history. So they started something called the all-volunteer force, where they no longer drafted anybody. You had to volunteer for the military, and men didn't do that. And they didn't have enough men to man the all-volunteer force, so they womaned it. They started bringing in women in greater numbers. We went from 1% of the force to 3% of the force in a very few years. Now, the percentages are small, but the numbers were big. So I was part of that bow wave of women, the very first women in the all-volunteer force. And subsequently, that allowed me to be the first in every job that I had, which was super exciting. It was just very, very challenging, and I loved it.
So you rose up pretty high up in the Navy as a captain, naval captain. What was one of the biggest obstacles that you had getting to that position as a captain?
Such a good question. I never look back and feel like I had obstacles. I had nothing but opportunities. And it was very, very invigorating. I truly loved it. Didn't regret a day. Now, I do look back and kind of smile at some of the comments that I had and didn't realize that they were crude at the time. For example, I had one petty officer then in my first duty station who said, Miss Catlin, you're not that ugly. Why did you join the Navy? His reality, and the reality is a lot of women in the Navy, got married, got pregnant, got out, not necessarily in that order. It was sort of a lark of fun, like, oh, I'm going to join the Navy and travel. And, they didn't take their job seriously. So, and then the other sort of crowd were women that were not very attractive, and they thought they could marry up in the Navy. So his comment to me was heartfelt, and it was a compliment in his eyes.
Yeah, I think that none of us would call that a compliment, but we understand that it was the time too. It was, I think things have changed now and that's not tolerated. So I guess that's a good thing. I understand you were commanding officer of the naval station in Guam. That's pretty darn impressive. What was the most challenging aspect of your role as a commanding officer?
Oh, that was a great assignment. It's my retirement job, so it was kind of the culmination of 27 years. Clearly, the hardest thing for me to do in Guam was to let go, relieve, fire, whatever fancy word you want to call it. But the base in Guam went from federal employees to contract employees in a single moment. And when it came time for me to and most of those employees, to be fair, were rehired by the contractor. But a lot of very dedicated federal employees, Guamanians, lost their jobs. And when they brought in a stack of papers for me to sign, which were their termination documents, they wanted to do an auto sign. And I said, no, I will sign every single one of these. And I will take that moment to seriously consider what this person's life is. I don't want to have an auto stamp on a firing letter.
I think that's really
Oh my
important.
gosh.
I think the hardest thing that I had to do was let people go when you knew that they were still doing a great job, but the company or whatever wanted to go in a different direction. That is the hardest thing to do because it's nothing that they've done a fault of their own. It's just business.
Exactly.
That's the
I would tend to say that the hardest thing about getting rid of somebody or firing somebody is when they're not doing a good job. And all the documentation or the work you have to put in order to make that happen, and the
validate.
frustration as a worker when you have somebody in your team that is not pulling their weight. So it's just a different way to think. I didn't really have to get rid of anybody that was really good. So maybe that's just my experience.
a lot more paperwork involved if you have to terminate somebody for a specific reason.
Another moment that I had was not in Guam, but back in the early 80s that we had the AIDS epidemic.
Absolutely.
And everybody in the military is what we call the walking blood bank, where if you're deployed at sea, you don't have the luxury of going to the blood bank and getting good blood. A sailor has to give sailor blood to another sailor. So we had to have 100% confidence in our blood bank, which meant every person in the Navy had to be tested for AIDS. You can imagine that we had a certain percentage that were positive. It was the job of the officer in charge, the commanding officer, to call that person in and let them know that they were positive for HIV and that they would be processed out of the Navy. In my particular command at the time, I had 14 sailors test positive for AIDS, and I had to call them in and basically tell them they were going to die.
Oh,
because this was before we had any treatment for AIDS. So it was a very, very hard conversation. My takeaway from that was some of them were very relieved. They said, you know what? I knew it. And some of them were totally surprised. They had a wife and children and completely melted down in front of me. And it was the range of human emotions between, oh, okay, let's get on with it, to, oh my God, I'm going to die. It was a very, very hard moment for me in the Navy.
I can't imagine. That would be very difficult. So you eventually joined the Girl Scouts. One of the projects you initiated was Operation Thin Mints, which I love. Can you talk a little bit about that program and what inspired you to create it?
Oh, sure. After the horrors of 9/11, our girls, the Girl Scouts in San Diego, wanted to do something for the military. So they wanted to mail a box of cookies to a program called Any Sailor. So I knew that you don't mail anything by bulk. It would be very expensive, completely logistically impossible. I knew that you ship things in containers if you're looking at volume. So we shipped a container of Girl Scout cookies donated by their customers. So these were all free gifts. We had to get permission from the Secretary of the Navy to do this because it was considered a gift and you don't bribe the Navy and blah, blah, blah. Well, anyway, I had worked for the Secretary of the Navy and I knew how to do that. So we got permission from the Secretary of the Navy. I got my friend in Singapore, who was the logistics captain there, and to accept the container of cookies, And with all of the cookie boxes came a little note from a Girl Scout that said, good luck, come back safely, we love you. So it was a wonderful community service project of Girl Scouts. But the funny thing about this thing is it was so popular, the next year we had 3 containers of cookies. To go to Singapore. I called my friend. He said he could take care of them. The next year we had 5 containers of cookies. And he said, Jody, you got a cookie monster. Find out someplace else to take them. So since then, Girl Scout San Diego has sent cookies to, Bahrain, Africa. We even got a submarine in the Arctic to take cookies. We've sent cookies all over the world on behalf of Girl Scouts in San Diego.
I love that. I love Girl Scout cookies, but I don't like the calories. I donate. I'm usually donating to the troops. So I really, really like that. So you've been mentoring people in the Girl Scouts and in the Navy. Can you talk a little bit about your mentoring approach?
I would say, first of all, listen. Did I say that enough? Because everybody has a different source of happiness, and it's important to find out what motivates them. And then you can be a much, much better mentor. I had a sailor who was a very hard worker, a very effective and important person in our office, and I relied on him. And my only power for him was to let him go home a little early or do something nice for him, but to give him positive motivation. And I said, you did a great job today. Why don't you go home early? He says, no, that's okay. I'll finish up stuff. He stayed 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. I said, Paymaster Hicks, you need to go home. Give yourself some quality of life and liberty. And he looked at me and he says, I don't want to go home. I hate my wife. And that was a moment of learning for me, is that his happiness was being appreciated in the office working. And don't assume that everybody wants to go home to a happy home. So it really taught me to listen to what somebody makes them happy. And then you have this tool for motivating them that is priceless, but you have to listen first.
I love the idea of finding out what makes people happy. We've talked a lot in a lot of the episodes about joy and passion. It sounds like he found his joy and passion in his day job, as it were, and that is not something that we've heard before. So I think that's really a great point. I know I loved my career, and when I was there working and I was creating, it was very joyful. I mean, yes, there was stress and there were things that I didn't like about management and what have you, but I loved my job. And sometimes I would be there till 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, and it was okay.
Yeah. So I know you kind of touched on this before when talking about the Girl Scouts and encouraging young girls. If young girls come up to you when you were in the Girl Scouts and wanted some advice on what you would do, how would you approach them that might be different than how you would approach somebody in the Navy?
The Girl Scouts had a founder, Juliet Gordon Lowe, whatever pokes them. So I said, well, what would Juliet Lowe do? They're not really asking me for advice. I think they're validating their own learnings.
Right.
Turn it back to them and say, well, what do you think? What would Juliet Lowe do? What role models out there that they already know about can help them? Generally, a little girl doesn't talk to me directly. She's always with her mom. So that mom, I would talk to the little guy. I'd always look down. I'm taller than they are. Look down at them. I'd say, Rebecca, what do you think? What are you doing? What makes you happy? What are you good at? And you never, ever, ever tell them they look cute. You never assign their value to how they look, because unfortunately, that just reinforces what the world thinks about girls. Stop it. Say something that is much more empowering, like, that was a smart thing to say. Oh, tell me more about that. Encourage their mental values, not their physical. So usually they're with their mom, and I will be talking to the girl. I say, well, tell me about your favorite subject. And then she'll look up at her mom, and her mom will say, oh, she really likes drawing. And then after about the 3rd time the mom answers for her daughter, I will look at the mom right in her eye and say, I'm talking to Rebecca. And the mom will go, oh.
Yeah, it's important. So you triggered something for me, and I will never forget this. My daughter at 6 years old I can't remember what she was doing, and someone complimented her on her looks. And she looked at me and looked at that person and said, I don't want to be remembered for how pretty I am. I want people to respect me that I'm smart. She's 6 years old, and she's already got that figured out.
Wait, you're a good mom.
More power to her.
I had this in my family. My sister was always the one that was so beautiful and everybody complimented her, and I was not. And that has stayed with me my entire life as a value of what I look like and am I good enough? And it's very destructive. And I think, we're trying to talk to our listeners and give them good advice. And I really think this one hits home with me
Yes.
in a big, big way.
Well, looks are fleeting. I mean, that is also superficial, and knowing the person's what makes them happy and important is what is more important than what their appearance is. So
Jody, can you talk a little bit about, if you could pick one person, your biggest influence in your life?
Well, don't we all say our dad or our mom? So I'll say that and just say nobody comes near my dad for influencing my life. But I would also say in the military, it was those egalitarian men who had no business giving me an opportunity. I was not good at it. Colonel Lehan, for example, I was teaching at the National Defense University, and he says, I want you to help me with teaching the Nuclear Defense Industry Study Group. And I go, are you kidding me? I can't spell nuclear. He says, you can do it. And he gave me a couple books. He says, just read this. These are the things you need to know. We're going to go on field trips. We're going to take the students to the French nuclear industry, and we're going to do the waste isolation project in Carlsbad. I had to really work hard to meet that standard, but he pushed me. He pulled me. So it's the men in your life that, if you don't have women role models, that are really, really important. And when we had, I was at the Naval Academy, and the women there used to have a phrase that the definition of a feminist is a man who has a daughter at the Naval Academy. So dads are just great.
I'm glad that you had a supported dad, and I'm glad that you had supported men in the Navy. That's really important. Unfortunately, I don't think that's always the case, but I think that's really wonderful that you had that as an experience. So you're currently teaching at Randy School of Management at the University of California in San Diego. What is that curriculum, and what inspired you to do that?
Sure. Even after working 45 years in the workforce, I was not ready to go home. And an opportunity came to teach at Rady School of Management at UC San Diego. And it's social entrepreneurship. We find that young people want to do good. They want to work for sustainable businesses. They want to make a difference in the world. They're very concerned about the environment. So they're good people. But they also want to make money. They have to make money. They've got student loans. They got issues. They want to buy houses. So most young people think you can't have both. Well, this is a course that introduces them how you can do both. If you want to do good in the world, don't jump on the next plane to Kabul and think you're going to change life for the women and the Taliban. You're not. And you don't have to be a missionary or a pauper to do good in the world. You can be an extraordinary business person, make money, and make the world a better place. So my course is an introductory course to show them how they can do that and give them case studies on that.
I love it.
So we're going to wrap it here, but one of the questions, Jody, we always ask, and we love to, share this information with our listeners, is what is your biggest life lesson and any other advice that you might have to give our listeners before we wrap this up?
Sure. That if you can glance through those 12 lessons in leadership, there may be one that grabs you. But I would say the first one, success does not happen by magic. It takes hard work. You have to work hard. That's just absolutely foundational. And if you're lucky, you will have success, but it's not going to happen without hard work.
So the 12 lessons in leadership that you shared with us, is that something that you created, or is that something that you were given?
11 of these lessons were lessons I learned from other people, other mentors and leaders along the way. One, I wrote myself. And when I, talk in public, I always say, which one do you think I wrote? And one is, a seat back and a table tray beats a desk any day. That one I learned by myself. That means if you have a chance to travel, go. If your boss says, we need you in Boston tomorrow morning, pack up your bags and go. So those opportunities to travel are just so enriching and so educational. That's one of my touchstones.
I think that's great. And as somebody who has traveled a lot and lived overseas, which our listeners know that by now, I can say it shapes your life. It changes. Even here within the U.S., there are so many cultures and there's so many diverse places to learn about things. I would totally 100% agree with you. Get out of your comfort zone of staying in your four walls and, meet other people and integrate with other people. And it really does. It's a life changer. So I think it's great advice. And I love your leadership lesson. We will be posting these on our social media. So we have a Facebook page and Instagram, Empowered Life Lessons. So please look us up if you want to see these 12 life lessons. We'll post them up when this particular episode drops. So thank you, Jody. This has been great. I think there's too many takeaways, some amazing comments that you made and nuggets that I'm sure our listeners are going, wow, light bulb moments. So thank you.
There was, and different perspective than what we've had. So I really love this. Thank you so much for joining us today.
To our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Empowered Life Lessons of Everyday Women. We would really appreciate if you could leave us a rating or a review. If you have any challenges or questions you are facing, we want to hear from you as we value your input and suggestions. And if you have a compelling story or life lesson you would like to share, please connect with us at empoweredlifelessons@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, other social media platforms, or visit us at empoweredlifelessons.com. In our next episode, meet Anna. She has had a fascinating career in law, working with domestic violence victims, death row clients, and then transitioned to leadership coaching.